At 3:37 in the morning, a phone call shattered the silence of my bedroom. It was my father. His voice barely a whisper, shaking with a kind of terror I had never heard from him before. He told me he was at the police precinct downtown. He said my sister-in-law had beaten him with a baseball bat, but when the police arrived, she pointed the finger at him, claiming he attacked her in a fit of mental illness. The worst part was that my own brother stood right there and let her lie. I threw on a trench coat over my pajamas and drove like a maniac. When I walked through those precinct doors, the officer at the front desk turned chalk white. He stumbled over his own words, stammering out apologies because he had no idea who I really was. The drive to the precinct was a blur of flashing streetlights and a mounting sense of dread. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept replaying my father's terrified voice in my head. He had always been the peacemaker, the one who swallowed his pride to keep my mother and brother happy. For him to call me at this hour meant things had escalated far beyond their usual toxic dynamics. I knew exactly what Caroline was capable of. She was a master manipulator who used her tears as a weapon, knowing perfectly well how the world viewed a crying white woman compared to an older black man. She knew the system was rigged in her favor, and she was playing it like a finely tuned instrument. The precinct lobby was an absolute circus when I pushed through the heavy double doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh clinical glare on a scene that made the blood freeze in my veins. There, sitting on a sterile metal bench, surrounded by three sympathetic police officers, was my sister-in-law, Caroline. She was weeping theatrically, clutching a tissue to a microscopic scratch on her forehead. Her blonde hair was artfully disheveled, and she was playing the role of the fragile victim to absolute perfection. The officers, all white men, were hovering over her, offering her bottled water and murmuring words of comfort as if she were a wounded bird. Then I looked past her performative display and saw the reality of the situation. My father, Harrison, a 65-year-old retired history teacher and the gentlest man I know, was sitting in the far corner of the room. He was handcuffed to a metal ring securely fastened to the concrete wall. Blood was drying on the side of his head, matting his gray hair, and dripping onto the collar of his favorite cardigan. His eyes stared blankly at the linoleum floor. He looked utterly broken, stripped of his dignity, and treated like a violent criminal. My father had been the only person who secretly supported me when my mother threw me out. He used to sneak me $50 bills from his modest teacher pension just so I could eat while I studied for my bar exam. He was a man who spent 40 years teaching history at an underfunded public school, pouring his heart into his students. Seeing him treated like a street thug sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights with his dignity stripped away broke my heart. But the heartbreak lasted only a second before it hardened into pure cold rage. Standing right next to the officers, comforting his weeping wife, was my brother Andre. Andre was the golden boy, the startup CEO, who wore his tailored suits like armor. He was rubbing Caroline's back and speaking in hushed, serious tones to the lead officer. I could hear his words echoing in the quiet lobby. "I am so sorry," Officer Andre was saying, shaking his head with feigned sadness. "My father is losing his mind. He has these episodes and he just snapped. He is a danger to society, and my poor wife was just trying to defend herself from his unprovoked rage." A red-hot fury ignited in my chest, spreading through my limbs like wildfire. I marched across the lobby, my heels clicking sharply against the tile, announcing my presence. Andre saw me approaching, and his face immediately twisted into a familiar sneer of disgust. He stepped away from Caroline and moved to block my path, puffing out his chest to establish dominance. "What are you doing here?" Naomi, Andre hissed, grabbing my arm and trying to shove me back toward the exit. "Get out of here before you make this worse. You look like a mess. You are going to make us look ghetto in front of these officers. We are dealing with a delicate situation, and we do not need your dramatic failure energy ruining it." I ripped my arm out of his grip. My eyes locked on our father, who had finally looked up, his eyes brimming with tears of relief upon seeing me. "I am here to take Dad home," I said, my voice low and dangerous, completely ignoring my brother's insults. Andre let out a loud, mocking laugh, ensuring the officers could hear him. "Take him home with what money? You do not even have a job." You are just a dropout. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of before you embarrass the family again. Caroline has been through enough trauma tonight without you adding to the circus. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to his provocations. Andre and my mother Yvonne had spent the last 10 years treating me like a contagious disease. A decade ago, I made the unforgivable mistake of dropping out of medical school. My mother had my entire life planned out, wanting me to become a prestigious surgeon, to elevate our family status, and prove our worth to her elitist social circle. She was absolutely obsessed with the concept of black excellence, but her version of it was entirely rooted in proximity to white wealth and superficial titles. When I told her I was leaving medicine to accept a full-ride scholarship in criminal law, she lost her mind. She called me a ghetto failure, a massive disappointment who would never amount to anything. She kicked me out of the house screaming that Andre was her only pride and joy because he understood how the world really worked. Andre had spent his whole life desperate for white validation. He styled his entire existence around the approval of elite circles, joining the right country clubs, wearing the right brands, and ultimately marrying Caroline. My mother fed this delusion. She believed that marrying into a white family with purported old money was the ultimate achievement, the final stamp of arrival for our family. She completely ignored the fact that Caroline treated our father like hired help, constantly belittling him in his own home. For 10 years, they assumed I was a struggling law school dropout working dead-end jobs in some forgotten corner of the city. They never bothered to check what I actually did with my life. They never knew that I had climbed the ranks with ruthless efficiency to become the deputy chief district attorney for this exact city, handling the highest profile cases in the state. I had spent the last decade building an empire of justice and quiet wealth, while they played pretend in their fragile glass house built on lies and credit card debt. Caroline peeked out from behind her tissue, her blue eyes wide with manufactured innocence. "Andre, please tell your sister to leave," she whimpered, her voice trembling perfectly. "I am already so traumatized by what your father did to me. I cannot handle her yelling right now. It is giving me terrible anxiety." Her performance was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood, using her status to immediately criminalize a black elder. The lead officer stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his utility belt. "Ma'am, you need to step back," he ordered, giving me a hard, dismissive look. "This is an active investigation, and the victim is highly distressed. If you do not leave the premises immediately, I will have you arrested for interfering with police business." I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply stepped around my brother, ignoring his angry protests, and walked straight up to the high desk where the desk sergeant was typing away on his computer. "Sergeant Miller," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and terrifyingly calm. The sergeant, an older man with graying hair, let out an annoyed sigh and looked up, ready to bark an order at me to leave the building. The moment his eyes met mine, the annoyance vanished completely. His jaw went slack. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. He knocked over his half-empty coffee cup, sending brown liquid spilling across his keyboard, but he did not even seem to notice the mess. He leaped to his feet so fast his chair rolled backward and slammed loudly into a metal filing cabinet. "Deputy Chief!" He stammered, his voice cracking as he scrambled to stand at attention and smoothed down his uniform shirt. "I am so sorry, Mom. I had no idea. We did not know he was your father. Nobody told us." The entire lobby went dead silent. The officers surrounding Caroline froze, their hands dropping to their sides as they processed the title. Caroline's fake sobs stopped instantly, the tissue falling from her face as she stared at the sergeant in utter confusion. Andre looked like he had been struck by lightning, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. I slowly turned to face the lead officer who had just threatened to arrest me. His eyes were wide with panic, realizing he had just threatened the second highest-ranking prosecutor in the entire district. "You were saying, officer?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You were going to arrest me for checking on my father." The officer swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Deputy Chief, I apologize profusely. We received a domestic violence call from the lady. She stated your father attacked her unprovoked. We were just following standard procedure based on her testimony." "Standard procedure," I repeated, gesturing toward my father. Does standard procedure include handcuffing a bleeding, 65-year-old man to a bench without offering him medical attention while you serve bottled water to a woman with a paper cut? The officers exchanged terrified glances. Nobody moved. Take the cuffs off my father, I ordered, the command echoing off the sterile walls. Now. Two officers practically tripped over themselves, rushing over to my father, pulling out their keys with shaking hands. The heavy metal cuffs fell away with a clatter. I walked over and gently helped my father to his feet. He leaned heavily against me, his hands trembling. "I have got you, Dad," I whispered, wrapping my coat around his shoulders. "You are safe now." Andre finally found his voice, though it was weak and unsteady. "Deputy Chief," he repeated, staring at me as if I were a stranger. "Naomi, what is going on? How did you get that title? You are a dropout." I looked at my brother, feeling nothing but absolute disdain for the man standing before me. "I dropped out of medical school, Andre. I graduated at the top of my class from law school while you were busy playing pretend with your startup money." Caroline stepped forward, dropping the fragile victim act entirely. Her face flushed red with anger and sudden realization. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I do not care what her job is. That old man assaulted me in my own home. I want him charged. I am pressing charges right now, and I will have my parents' lawyers call the mayor if I have to." I turned to face my sister-in-law fully. My gaze swept over her, taking in her perfectly manicured nails and her expensive designer clothes. "You can call whoever you want, Caroline," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. "But I promise you, before the sun comes up, you will be the one needing a defense attorney." Before Caroline could respond, before Andre could jump in to defend his precious wife, the heavy glass doors of the precinct burst open with a loud crash. A woman rushed into the lobby, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the sterile tile floor. It was my mother, Yvonne. She was a woman who had spent her entire existence curating an image of flawless excellence, and even now, wearing her expensive silk sleepwear hastily covered by a luxury trench coat, her hair was perfectly wrapped. I watched her eyes frantically scan the room, taking in the police officers, the desk sergeant, and finally, her own family. My bleeding father looked at his wife of 40 years with a desperate and hopeful gaze. He was expecting the woman he loved to rush to his side and demand answers from the officers who had chained him like an animal. But that panic was not for the man she had been married to. She did not even glance at the blood drying on my father's temple, or the way he slumped against my side in sheer exhaustion. Her eyes slid right past her bleeding husband and locked onto Caroline sitting on the bench. Her entire focus, her entire world revolved entirely around preserving the fragile image of perfection she had built around her son. I braced myself, tightening my grip on my father's shoulder. The final pieces of my family were about to collide, and I was ready to burn their house of cards to the ground. Yvonne let out a dramatic gasp and rushed across the room, throwing her arms around her weeping daughter-in-law. "Oh, my poor sweet girl," my mother cried out, smoothing Caroline's messy blonde hair and closely examining the microscopic scratch on her pale forehead with utter absolute devastation. I stood there, feeling the heavy weight of my father sagging against my shoulder as he watched his wife comfort the woman who had just beaten him with a baseball bat. The heartbreak in his tired eyes was almost too much to bear, and my anger reached a boiling point. After ensuring Caroline was perfectly fine, my mother finally turned her attention to me. The maternal concern vanished instantly, replaced by a burning toxic fury that I remembered all too well from my youth. She marched across the lobby, her jaw set tight with completely absolute rage and pure hatred. Before I could even speak, she raised her hand and swung it toward my face with all the force she could possibly muster. But I was no longer the frightened 20-year-old dropout she remembered. I reached out and caught her wrist mid-air, stopping her hand mere inches from my cheek. My grip was like a steel vice, and I saw the deep shock register in her eyes as I simply refused to let her strike me. "Let go of me!" Yvonne shrieked loudly, struggling against my very firm hold while looking around at the watching police officers. "Are you using your little desk job to harass my daughter-in-law?" she yelled, pointing her free hand at my face. "Your father is senile, Naomi, and you know it. He is losing his mind every single day." He attacked Caroline in her own home, and you are abusing your legal power to protect a crazy, violent old man. I dropped her wrist, pushing her hand away as a wave of pure disgust washed over me. Yvonne was absolutely obsessed with her proximity to whiteness and wealth, viewing my brother and his marriage as her very ultimate social victory. She had always viewed Caroline as Andre's golden ticket into the elite high society she so desperately craved. To my mother, marrying into a wealthy white family was the final stamp of arrival for our bloodline, and she would sacrifice anything to protect that proximity to power. She was more than willing to throw her black husband under the bus to appease the white tears of a manipulative socialite. She had spent her entire life running from our roots, trying to wash away our history by wrapping herself in designer clothes and pretending she belonged to a completely different world. Andre stepped up right next to my mother, puffing out his chest to shield his precious wife from my gaze. "Do not try to act big and important in front of us, Naomi." He mocked, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You are just a bitter single black woman who is incredibly jealous that my wife comes from a real pedigree. You have always been envious of what we have because you have nothing. You sit alone in some tiny apartment while my life is moving forward, and you just want to drag us all down to your miserable level." He leaned in closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. But I stood my ground without blinking. "Her family is investing $10 million into my tech startup tomorrow morning." Andre hissed, his eyes wide with desperate greed. "If you arrest her tonight, you ruin my entire life and destroy everything I have worked so hard to build. Let Dad take the fall for this because he is old and useless anyway. He has no future left, but I am on the verge of becoming a major player in the tech industry, and you cannot ruin this now." I stared at my brother, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his absolute moral bankruptcy. He was willing to let our father rot in a prison cell or a psychiatric ward just so he could secure funding from his racist in-laws. "You would really let Dad take the blame for an assault he did not commit just for a check?" I asked, my voice eerily calm despite the storm raging inside my chest. Andre scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at our father, who was silently weeping as he listened to his own son sell his entire life away. "Dad is losing his memory and he needs professional help anyway," Andre argued callously, not even looking at the man who had raised him. "The police already believe Caroline because she looks like a victim and he looks like an aggressor. It is just the way the world works, Naomi, and you know it better than anyone. You work in the criminal justice system, so you know exactly what is going to happen if you push this. Just walk away and let the authorities handle Dad before you make a massive mistake that ends up destroying our family legacy forever." Caroline peeked out from behind my mother's, back, the tears magically drying up now that she knew her husband and mother-in-law were firmly on her side. She smirked at me, a tiny vicious curve of her lips that contained volumes of entitlement and racial privilege. She stepped slightly closer to me, ensuring the police officers across the lobby could not hear her next words. "A jury will always believe a crying woman like me over an angry black man," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous confidence. "You know I am right, so just back off right now." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the sterile air of the precinct lobby like a toxic cloud. She was actively weaponizing the deep systemic biases of the justice system against my father, and she was proud of it. She knew exactly how society viewed the tears of a wealthy white woman, and she was using that historical privilege to crush a gentle black elder who had never harmed a fly in his entire life. My mother stood there nodding in agreement, completely blinded by her desperate need to remain in the good graces of Caroline's wealthy family connections. I felt my father squeeze my hand, weakly, silently pleading with me to just let it go and avoid the conflict. He had spent his whole life avoiding conflict, making himself small so that others could feel big. But I was not going to make myself small tonight, and I was certainly not going to let these monsters destroy the only parent who had ever actually loved me unconditionally. I looked Caroline dead in the eye, refusing to let her see even a single ounce of hesitation or fear. "You really think you hold all the cards here now, Caroline?" Before she could formulate another snide remark, the heavy precinct doors swung open once again, letting in a gust of freezing night air. A wealthy-looking older couple stormed into the lobby, dripping with visible arrogance and old money entitlement. It was Preston and Chloe Sterling, Caroline's parents, the supposed billionaires who were funding Andre's tech startup. Preston was wearing a custom-tailored suit, even at this ridiculous hour, and Chloe was draped in a mink coat that probably cost more than my father's entire retirement savings. They looked around the police station with absolute disgust and pure sheer disdain. Following closely behind them was an expensive, slick defense lawyer carrying a premium leather briefcase and a look of predatory confidence. "Oh, my poor darling daughter," Chloe gasped, rushing over to embrace Caroline, wrapping her in the expensive mink coat. "Look what that horrible, violent man did to you. We came as fast as we could the moment your husband called us." Preston Sterling glared at my father with utter contempt, as if my dad were a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of his expensive leather shoes. "This is an absolute outrage," Preston bellowed loudly to the room. "I demand to know why this dangerous lunatic is not locked in a padded cell right now," Preston shouted, pointing a demanding finger at my father. "He violently assaulted my daughter, and he needs to be transferred to a high-security psychiatric ward immediately." The slick defense lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase and pulling out a stack of legal documents that had clearly been prepared in extreme haste. "I am representing Caroline Sterling, and we are officially demanding that Harrison be committed to a mental health facility for immediate evaluation and involuntary psychiatric hold pending felony criminal assault charges." My mother stepped forward, nodding eagerly in agreement with the very people who were trying to lock her husband away. "Yes, yes, he needs help," Yvonne babbled, attempting to curry favor with the powerful Sterling patriarch. "We fully support whatever medical intervention is necessary to keep Caroline safe." Andre stood tall next to his father-in-law, looking incredibly proud of himself for aligning with the winning team. The desk sergeant, who had been silently watching the entire exchange, looked over at me, his face pale and sweating profusely, knowing exactly who I was and what power I held. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what I would do against this overwhelming wall of wealth, privilege, and racial bias. They truly believed they had already won the battle. They thought their money and their status would easily steamroll over a supposedly uneducated dropout and an aging black man. Caroline was practically glowing with triumphant satisfaction, leaning against her mother's fur coat, while shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated victory. They had brought their big guns, and they expected me to cower in fear and simply walk away from my beloved bleeding father now. I felt my father slump heavily against me, his spirit completely broken by the combined betrayal of his wife, his son, and the vicious lies of his daughter-in-law. But as I looked at the arrogant faces of the Sterling family, the desperate social climbing of my mother, and the pathetic cowardice of my brother, I did not feel defeated. I felt the cold, calculated precision of a prosecutor who was about to dismantle a criminal enterprise piece by piece. They had absolutely no idea that they had just walked right into my heavily fortified jurisdiction of absolute authority. I slowly reached into my trenchcoat pocket and pulled out my official Deputy Chief District Attorney badge, letting the polished metal catch the harsh fluorescent light of the precinct lobby. The slick defense lawyer glanced at the badge, and his arrogant smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to comprehend why a supposed dropout was carrying the highest-ranking prosecutorial shield in the entire state. I took a deep breath, ready to unleash a legal and financial reckoning that would completely obliterate their entire world and leave their precious house of cards burning in the absolute dust. The slick defense lawyer stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly against the linoleum floor. He sneered at my badge for a fraction of a second before quickly composing his face into a mask of smug professional superiority. He introduced himself as Richard Vance, senior partner at one of the most ruthless law firms in the city. He did not care that I was the deputy chief district attorney because he was used to buying and bullying his way through the legal system on behalf of his wealthy elite clients. He unclasped his premium briefcase with a sharp, aggressive click and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed papers, aggressively slapping them onto the front desk, right under the sergeant's nose. "My clients are not here to debate the unfortunate reality of cognitive decline, Deputy Chief," he said, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. "We are here to execute an emergency medical intervention for a deeply disturbed man." He slid a specific document to the front of the pile, tapping his manicured finger heavily against a signature at the bottom of the page. "This is a sworn medical affidavit, signed by a board-certified psychiatrist, stating that Harrison is suffering from advanced violent dementia. The doctor has officially concluded that Harrison is a direct and immediate threat to himself and others, especially to his deeply traumatized daughter-in-law Caroline, who narrowly survived his vicious, unprovoked attack tonight. My father let out a weak gasp of pure betrayal, hearing them casually erase his entire sanity just to build a convenient legal defense for Caroline. My mother Yvonne nodded vigorously, wrapping her arm tightly around Caroline's shoulders and loudly agreeing to the entire lobby that my father had been losing his mind and acting violently for months. The lawyer continued his relentless assault, completely ignoring the hot tears rolling down my father's weathered cheeks. Based on this medical evaluation, we have prepared emergency power of attorney documents, the lawyer announced, pulling out another thick stack of heavily redacted papers. My client Andre, as the only mentally stable and successful male heir, is taking immediate legal control of Harrison's medical and financial decisions. This includes the immediate transfer of the deed to the family estate so that we can liquidate the asset to pay for the permanent psychiatric facility. Harrison will be moved to before the sun comes up today. The absolute vile nature of their evil plan clicked into place in my mind with sickening crystal-clear clarity. My father's house was not just some random piece of real estate. It was a stunning, fully paid-off generational Victorian mansion located right in the heart of a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. My grandparents had scrubbed floors and worked their entire lives to pay off that house, leaving it to my father as a sacred heirloom that was currently valued at well over $3 million. For months, I had known that Andre and Caroline were desperately trying to convince my dad to sell the house to fund their lavish fake lifestyle, but my father had steadfastly refused. He wanted the house to remain in our family forever, serving as a sanctuary for future generations. Now Caroline and her greedy elitist parents had orchestrated this entire violent charade just to declare him legally incompetent. They were going to lock my gentle, intelligent father in a mental asylum, throw away the key, and steal his $3 million home to pay off whatever massive debts their fake elite lifestyle had secretly incurred. I looked at my brother, who was standing there trying his hardest to look like a concerned son, making a tough medical choice. "You are trying to steal the house, Andre," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that made the entire crowded room lean in to listen. "You let your entitled wife beat our father with a baseball bat, and now you are trying to steal the only thing our grandparents managed to leave us." Andre scoffed, puffing out his chest and defensively adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Do not be so incredibly dramatic, Naomi," he sneered. "Dad cannot take care of that massive property anymore. Caroline and I are simply taking on the heavy burden of managing his complicated estate because someone has to be the responsible adult in this family. Her parents are bringing in top-tier investors tomorrow morning, and we need liquid capital to match their financial energy. Selling that old rundown house is the most logical step, and locking Dad away where he can get the help he clearly needs is just unfortunate collateral damage. It is entirely for his own good." Chloe Sterling Caroline's mother stepped forward, wrapping her luxurious mink coat tighter around her thin frame. She looked at my bleeding father with absolute pure disgust, wrinkling her nose as if simply breathing the same air as him was a personal insult to her high-class pedigree. "We are actually doing your broken family a massive favor," Chloe added, her tone reeking of white savior complex and unbearable staggering entitlement. "My husband Preston is using our elite society connections to ensure your dangerous father gets a bed at a private facility instead of being thrown into a violent state-run prison. You should all be thanking us on your knees instead of waving your little badge around trying to cause unnecessary trouble." I let their arrogant, venomous words hang in the heavy air of the police precinct, giving them the false, comforting hope that they had actually backed me into a corner. The defense lawyer smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, completely convinced that his forged medical document was the ultimate untouchable trump card. He pushed an expensive gold pen across the desk toward me. "If you really care about your father's well-being, Deputy Chief, you will advise him to sign the power of attorney right now," the lawyer demanded with smug certainty. "If you fight this, we will take this to a judge tonight, and we will make sure the national media knows exactly how the Deputy Chief District Attorney tried to protect a violent madman from facing justice." I did not argue emotionally. I did not scream or cry or lose my temper the way they desperately wanted me to, so they could label me as just another angry, aggressive woman. I simply reached out and picked up the supposedly ironclad medical document. I held the paper up to the harsh fluorescent light, scanning the dense medical jargon before my eyes locked firmly onto the signature at the very bottom of the page. Dr. Julian Graves. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I felt my father tense beside me, but I gently squeezed his shoulder, letting him know the tide was about to turn violently in our favor. I shifted into full Deputy Chief District Attorney mode, my posture straightening and my voice projecting with the practiced lethal authority of a prosecutor who had personally destroyed thousands of arrogant men, just like the lawyer standing before me. "This is a very impressive piece of fiction, Mr. Vance," I stated calmly, tossing the document back onto the desk with a casual flick of my wrist. The lawyer bristled, his smug expression faltering for a split second. "Excuse me?" He sputtered, hastily adjusting his suit jacket. "That is a legally binding medical diagnosis from a highly respected board-certified psychiatrist." I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that echoed through the silent, shocked lobby. "A highly respected board-certified psychiatrist," I repeated, perfectly mocking his exact condescending tone. "That is absolutely fascinating, Mr. Vance, considering the fact that Dr. Julian Graves permanently lost his medical license in the state of Illinois exactly 3 years ago." The color instantly drained from the lawyer's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His eyes darted nervously toward Preston Sterling, who suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable in his custom-tailored suit. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the lawyer, closing the distance between us, until I could see the heavy beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "I know this because I personally prosecuted Dr. Graves when he moved to this city and attempted to run a massive prescription fraud ring," I continued, my voice dropping into a lethal rhythmic cadence. "He is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. So unless your highly respected doctor evaluated my father from inside a maximum security cell block, this document is a blatant amateur forgery." The entire precinct erupted into a chaotic murmur of shock. The police officers who had been treating Caroline like a fragile, delicate victim suddenly shifted their hands, resting cautiously on their belts as they realized they were standing in the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy. The desk sergeant, who was already terrified of my presence, frantically began typing on his computer, verifying my claim, and letting out a sharp, loud gasp when he saw the federal prison record of Dr. Graves pop up on his monitor. The slick lawyer was sweating profusely now, aggressively pulling at his collar as his arrogant demeanor completely shattered into pieces. He looked frantically at Preston and Chloe, Sterling silently demanding an explanation for why they had confidently handed him a forged document signed by a convicted felon. "I did not know," the lawyer stammered, taking a huge step back and raising his hands defensively. "My clients provided me with this paperwork. I was assured it was entirely legitimate and legally sound. You are a senior partner at a major law firm, and you did not even bother to run a basic background check on your primary medical witness," I asked, raising a single judging eyebrow. "That is not just staggering, breathtaking incompetence, Mr. Vance, that is subornation of perjury and presenting a forged document to law enforcement officers in the direct execution of their duties. I wonder how the State Bar Association will react when I personally file a severe grievance against your license tomorrow morning." The lawyer looked like he was about to physically faint. He practically dropped his expensive briefcase, scrambling desperately to distance himself from the Sterling family. "I withdraw the document," he blurted out, his voice high and laced with pure panic. "I am formally withdrawing the power of attorney request." Preston Sterling grabbed the lawyer's arm, his face turning bright purple with explosive rage. "What are you doing, you coward?" Preston roared. "You work for me, you fix this right now." The lawyer violently yanked his arm out of Preston's grip. "I work for my firm and I am not losing my law license over your forged garbage," he shot back before quickly power walking out of the precinct doors, leaving the Sterling family completely exposed and legally defenseless. My mother, Yvonne, looked around in absolute horror, watching the expensive lawyer flee the scene. Her entire grand plan to secure her permanent place in the white elite was crumbling into dust right before her eyes. She turned to me, her face twisted in a pathetic mixture of fear and denial. "Naomi, what are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice echoing loudly off the walls. "You are ruining everything just because you are jealous of your brother. Caroline is still hurt. Your father still attacked her. You cannot just use a legal technicality to ignore the fact that he is a dangerous old man." I turned to my mother, feeling a profound sense of heavy sadness that this woman had birthed me, but I pushed the useless emotion down, locking it safely away. "The only danger in this room is the incredible greed radiating from your golden boy and his manipulative wife," I said coldly. "You were perfectly willing to let them lock your faithful husband in a mental asylum and steal the house he worked his whole life to pay for, just so you could sip cheap champagne at the country club with these absolute frauds." Andre stepped forward, trying desperately to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. He pointed a shaking, sweaty finger at me, his face slick with panic. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Naomi?" he yelled, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "Fine, so the medical paper was a mistake. Caroline was just so terrified for her life that her parents rushed the paperwork to protect her from a madman. It does not change the core facts of what actually happened tonight." He grabbed Caroline's arm, pulling her forward to display the tiny red scratch on her forehead to the crowded room. "Look at her," Andre demanded loudly, playing heavily to the remaining police officers. "My wife is bleeding. She is severely traumatized. Dad lost his temper and hit her with a baseball bat. That is aggravated assault and battery. You can tear up all the paperwork you want, but you cannot change the physical fact that a violent crime was committed against an innocent, defenseless woman." Caroline immediately picked up on her husband's cue, realizing that her elaborate scheme to steal the house had failed, and she now needed to rely entirely on her ultimate weapon: her tears. She let out a loud, dramatic, wailing sob, burying her face in her hands and shaking her shoulders to simulate a massive, terrifying panic attack. She stumbled forward, clutching the edge of the front desk and looking up at the desk sergeant with wide, watery blue eyes. "Please, you have to help me protect myself," Caroline cried, her voice quivering with perfect theatrical timing. I was just trying to bring him a warm cup of tea and he went completely crazy. He grabbed his old baseball bat from the corner of the room and he just started swinging at my head. I begged him to stop, but he kept screaming that I did not belong in his house because of my skin color. He hit me, and I barely managed to escape with my life. "Look at my face, look at what this monster did to me." Chloe Sterling wrapped her arms tightly around her weeping daughter, glaring at my father with utter racist contempt. "You see this?" Chloe demanded loudly, addressing the entire police precinct. "This is exactly what happens when you try to help these kinds of people. My beautiful daughter has been nothing but a generous angel to that violent old man, and this is how he violently repays her kindness. He belongs in a cage for the rest of his miserable life." My father tried to speak, his voice raspy and broken from exhaustion. "I never touched her," he whispered, tears spilling down his bruised and battered face. "I was sitting quietly in my study reading. She came in screaming about signing the deed to the house. She broke the expensive vase herself. She hit me with the bat until I fell, and then she called the police. Please, you have to believe me, I am telling the truth." Yvonne rolled her eyes, letting out a loud scoff of complete disbelief. "Oh, shut up, Harrison," my mother snapped cruelly. "Stop embarrassing yourself and just admit what you did. Caroline is a delicate girl. She would never ever do something like that to herself." The police officers shifted uncomfortably, looking between my bleeding father and the weeping Caroline. The systemic bias was thick and palpable in the air. Despite the fact that I had just explicitly proven the Sterling family was using forged medical documents to steal a $3 million house, the visual of a crying white socialite was still incredibly powerful. Caroline knew this fact intimately, and she leaned into it heavily, milking every single tear for maximum emotional effect. I watched the pathetic performance with absolute cold detachment. Caroline truly believed she had won the narrative back. She thought she had brilliantly outsmarted the system because the system was historically designed to protect people exactly like her. She thought that without a video or a neutral witness, it would simply be her word against my father's, and she was completely confident that the world would always choose her tears over his truth. Caroline lifted her head, wiping away a fake shimmering tear, and looking at me with a sickening smirk that was entirely hidden from the police officers, but perfectly visible to me. She leaned slightly forward, her voice dropping into a malicious hissing whisper that only I and Andre could hear over the commotion. "It does not matter how smart you think you are," Naomi Caroline whispered, her eyes flashing with pure toxic triumph. "He hit me." There were no cameras in the hallway. It is his word against mine, and I have the bruises. You can play lawyer all you want, but at the end of the day, they will always believe me over him, so just back off right now before I make this so much worse for your pathetic father. I looked down at Caroline as her malicious whisper faded into the sterile, cold air of the police precinct. She was so incredibly confident in her little performance. She truly believed that centuries of systemic bias would shield her from any consequences whatsoever. She thought her pale skin and fake tears were an absolute impenetrable armor against the truth. She was completely certain that the police would take one look at her manufactured bruises and immediately throw my elderly black father into a concrete cell without asking a single question. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not flinch or show even a fraction of the anger that was currently boiling inside my chest. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the exact same smile I used in the courtroom, right before I completely obliterated a hostile witness on the stand. "You are absolutely right, Caroline," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the quiet lobby so that every single police officer could hear me. "There are no cameras in the hallway of my father's house." I watched her smug smirk widen for a fraction of a second, thinking she had just won the ultimate victory. She thought I was conceding defeat. But then I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us, until I was looking down directly into her wide, calculating eyes. "There are no cameras in the hallway," Caroline, I repeated slowly, emphasizing every single syllable. "But there are multiple hidden cameras in the study." The color drained from Caroline's face so fast, she looked like she might physically pass out right there on the linoleum floor. Her smug, arrogant smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Andre stumbled backward, bumping into the front desk, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. My mother Yvonne froze completely still, her hands dropping from where they had been comforting her precious daughter-in-law. Preston and Chloe Sterling, the supposed billionaires who had been screaming for my father's arrest, suddenly looked around the room as if searching for an emergency exit. Right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the precinct slid open, and my executive assistant Maya walked into the lobby. She was wearing a sharp-tailored suit and carrying a sleek silver laptop under her arm. Maya was the best investigator on my legal team, and she knew exactly what to do without me ever having to say a single word. I had texted her 30 minutes ago while I was driving to the station, instructing her to pull the cloud feed from the hidden security system I had installed in my father's house last month. I had placed those small, discreet cameras in the living room and the study because I already suspected Caroline was sneaking around the house trying to steal my late grandmother's antique jewelry. I never imagined those cameras would end up capturing an attempted murder. Maya walked straight past the trembling Sterling family and placed the laptop firmly on the front desk right next to the sergeant. "Deputy Chief, the footage has been successfully downloaded and enhanced for optimal audio and visual clarity," Maya stated professionally, tapping a few keys on the keyboard. I nodded and turned to the desk sergeant, who was still sweating profusely. "Sergeant, I need you to connect this laptop to the large presentation monitor on the wall behind you," I ordered calmly. "This is officially evidence in a felony assault investigation, and I want every single officer in this room to see exactly what happened in that house tonight." The sergeant scrambled to obey, practically tripping over his own feet as he grabbed a display cable and connected it to the large flat-screen monitor hanging on the precinct wall. The screen flickered to life, casting a bright, harsh glow over the silent, crowded lobby. Every single police officer in the room turned their attention to the monitor. The officers who had been handing Caroline bottled water and treating her like a delicate, fragile victim now stood with their arms crossed, their faces completely stern and unreadable. They knew they were about to see something that would completely change the entire narrative. I pressed the play button on the laptop. The video feed filled the massive screen in crisp, stunning 4K resolution. The hidden camera had been placed inside a vintage grandfather clock on the top shelf of the bookcase, providing a perfect, unobstructed wide-angle view of my father's entire study. The audio was incredibly clear, picking up every single sound in the quiet room. The video started by showing my father Harrison sitting peacefully in his worn leather armchair. He was wearing his reading glasses, holding a thick historical biography in his hands, and sipping a cup of warm tea. He looked exactly like what he was, a gentle retired teacher, enjoying a quiet evening in the house he had lived in for 40 years. The scene was an absolute picture of domestic tranquility. Then the heavy wooden door of the study flew open, and Caroline marched into the room. On the giant monitor, her face was twisted into an ugly, vicious scowl that completely contradicted the sweet, innocent persona she had been playing all night at the police station. She was clutching a thick stack of legal documents in one hand, and she aggressively slammed them down onto the small table next to my father's reading chair. "Sign the deed!" Caroline demanded on the video, her voice shrill and echoing loudly through the precinct lobby. "Andre and I need the liquid capital from this rundown property to match my parents' investment tomorrow morning. You are going to sign the house over to us right now, or I swear I will make your life a living nightmare." On the screen, my father slowly lowered his book. He looked up at his daughter-in-law with a profound sense of exhausted sadness. He did not raise his voice or act aggressively in any way. "Caroline, I have told you and Andre a dozen times," my father said, his recorded voice sounding so incredibly tired. "This house belonged to my parents. It is a generational family home. I am not selling it so you can fund a lavish lifestyle you cannot actually afford. Please leave my study and let me read in peace." The entire police precinct watched in absolute dead silence as Caroline completely lost her mind on the high-definition screen. She started pacing back and forth across the study, waving her arms frantically and screaming at my father. "You selfish, useless old man!" she shrieked, her face turning a bright, blotchy red. "My family is trying to elevate your pathetic son into elite society, and you are holding us back because you are too obsessed with this disgusting ghetto house." My father simply shook his head and picked his book back up, refusing to engage with her toxic tantrum. This absolute dismissal sent Caroline into a blind, violent rage. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a heavy ceramic vase sitting on the mantel. The security footage captured every single agonizing frame of what happened next. Caroline grabbed the vase, raised it high in the air, and intentionally smashed it directly against her own forehead. The sound of the ceramic shattering echoed through the quiet police station, making several officers physically flinch. Caroline stumbled backward from the self-inflicted blow, blood trickling down her face, creating the exact tiny scratch she had been crying about all night. My father dropped his book and jumped out of his chair, holding his hands up in a defensive, pacifying gesture. "Caroline, what are you doing?" he yelled, clearly terrified by her sudden self-harm. But Caroline was not finished. She turned toward the corner of the study, where my father kept a vintage wooden baseball bat, signed by a famous local player. She grabbed the heavy wooden bat, gripping it tightly in both hands. She spun around, her face contorted into a mask of pure evil, and swung the bat with all her might directly at my father's left knee. The sickening crunch of the wood hitting his bone echoed loudly from the monitor speakers. My father let out an agonizing cry of pain, collapsing heavily onto the hardwood floor, holding his shattered knee. The police officers in the lobby let out collective gasps of pure horror, watching the horrific, unprovoked brutality unfold right before their eyes. Caroline stood over my helpless, bleeding father, raising the bat again and bringing it down hard against the side of his head. My father slumped over, completely motionless, blood pooling on the expensive rug beneath him. But the most devastating part of the video was not the violent assault itself. The most heartbreaking moment happened just seconds later. The study door opened wider, and my brother Andre stepped into the frame. He stood right in the doorway, looking down at his own father, bleeding unconscious on the floor. He looked at his wife standing over the old man with a bloody baseball bat in her hands. Andre did not rush forward to help his dad. He did not yell at Caroline or try to take the weapon away from her. Instead, my brother calmly reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out his expensive smartphone, and dialed 911. The hidden camera picked up the audio of his call perfectly. "Yes, I need police immediately," Andre said into his phone, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "My father has lost his mind. He is suffering from a violent mental breakdown, and he just attacked my wife unprovoked. Please hurry, he is dangerous." After making the call, Andre simply turned his back on our bleeding father, walking out of the study and gently closing the door behind him, leaving the old man alone on the floor with his attacker. The video feed stopped displaying a black screen, but the horrifying images were permanently burned into the minds of everyone standing in that precinct. The silence in the lobby was absolutely deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed down on the room like a physical weight. The white police officers who had been comforting Caroline just 10 minutes ago were now staring at her with looks of absolute pure, unadulterated disgust. The desk sergeant shook his head slowly, muttering a quiet curse under his breath. The truth was now entirely undeniable. They had all witnessed a vicious, premeditated attempted murder, followed by a calculated racist frame job designed to lock an innocent black man in a cage. Caroline was trembling violently, her entire body shaking as the realization of her total destruction finally set in. The protective mask of white victimhood she had worn so proudly was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the ugly, violent criminal underneath. She looked around the room, seeking any friendly face, but the officers deliberately took several steps away from her, treating her like the dangerous predator she truly was. Preston and Chloe Sterling looked absolutely horrified, but not because an innocent man had been brutally beaten. They were horrified because their pristine high society reputation was about to be dragged through the mud and exposed on national television. Preston tried to open his mouth to yell an excuse to blame the camera angle or claim it was a deep fake, but the sheer undeniable clarity of the 4K footage made any defense completely impossible. He wisely snapped his mouth shut, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Andre was hyperventilating, clutching his chest as he stared at the blank screen. He had just watched himself commit the ultimate betrayal of his own flesh and blood, and he knew that his life was entirely over. His startup, his fake wealth, his elite status. It was all burning to the ground right in front of him. "Naomi," Andre whispered, his voice cracking pitifully. "Please, it is not what it looks like." I panicked. I was scared. I did not even dignify his pathetic lie with a response. I simply turned my gaze to the desk sergeant who was already reaching for his radio. "Sergeant," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade. "You have just witnessed irrefutable video, evidence of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, filing a false police report, elder abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud. I expect the perpetrators to be processed and placed in holding cells immediately without bail." The sergeant nodded firmly, his face set in grim determination. "Yes, Deputy Chief, right away." "Mom," he responded, gesturing sharply to the other officers in the room to move in and make the arrests. But before the officers could even take a single step forward, my mother Yvonne did the most unthinkable, horrific thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Instead of rushing over to check on my father after watching him get brutally beaten with a baseball bat instead of screaming at the daughter-in-law who had tried to murder her husband, Yvonne threw herself onto the dirty linoleum floor of the police station. She crawled across the space between us, desperately grabbing the hem of my trench coat with both hands. She dropped to her knees, looking up at me with wild, frantic eyes, completely ignoring the blood still staining my father's cardigan. Naomi, I am begging you." Yvonne screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the concrete walls. "Delete the video. Tell the officers it was a mistake." I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling a wave of absolute revulsion that made my stomach physically churn. "You want me to delete the evidence of an attempted murder?" I asked, staring at her in sheer disbelief. "She just beat your husband half to death and you want me to let her walk away?" Yvonne gripped my coat tighter, crying real tears now. But they were tears of greedy desperation, not sorrow for her husband. "If she goes to jail, the Sterlings will pull the $10 million investment tomorrow morning," Yvonne wailed, shaking my coat violently. "Your brother will be totally ruined. His company will go bankrupt, and we will lose our only chance to finally belong to the elite society we deserve." He is your brother, Naomi. Please just do it for the family. I looked down at my mother, whose hands were still desperately clutching the fabric of my trench coat. She was openly weeping on the dirty linoleum floor of the police precinct, begging me to sacrifice my father's safety and my own integrity, just to protect the fragile illusion of wealth that my brother had married into. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. I reached down and slowly pried her trembling fingers off my coat one by one, treating her touch like a toxic substance. My voice was completely devoid of the sympathy she was frantically searching for when I finally spoke to her. You are asking me to ignore a brutal attempted murder, so your golden son can play pretend with a family of racist frauds, I asked, letting the sickening reality of her request hang heavily in the quiet air. The answer is absolutely no. I turned my back on my mother, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, as her grand social climbing dreams completely shattered around her. I gently guided my father out of the lobby, letting my trusted assistant Maya handle the official paperwork for the arrests of Caroline and the processing of the evidence. The night air outside the precinct was freezing, but the overwhelming sense of clarity kept me entirely warm. I carefully helped my father into the passenger seat of my car, treating him with the utmost tenderness. He was quiet, his breathing shallow as the shock of the evening's betrayal settled deep into his bones. I drove him straight to a private hospital where I had personal connections, ensuring he would be treated with maximum discretion and top-tier medical care. The emergency room doctors immediately took him back to treat his shattered knee and the severe blunt force trauma to his head. I stood guard outside his hospital room for the remainder of the night, ensuring no one from our toxic family could reach him or attempt to manipulate him while he was vulnerable. Watching the gentle man who had sacrificed everything for his children lying in a hospital bed broken by his own family filled me with a cold, calculating resolve. I was going to dismantle their entire lives. By the time the sun began to rise over the city skyline, I was sitting in my home office sipping black coffee and preparing the formal felony indictment documents for Caroline Sterling. I knew her parents were arrogant, but I also knew they were backed into a corner, and desperate people always make massive mistakes. My phone had buzzed continuously throughout the early morning hours with updates from the precinct. Caroline had been officially processed, fingerprinted, and placed in a concrete holding cell, completely stripping away her glamorous influencer facade. Preston and Chloe Sterling had spent the entire night frantically pacing the precinct lobby, calling every powerful political connection they had, trying to arrange immediate bail and somehow suppress the incident. What I did not anticipate was the sheer speed and malicious precision of their impending counterattack. Just before 8 in the morning, my assistant Maya called me, her voice uncharacteristically tight with panic. "Deputy Chief, you need to look at the local news blogs right now," Maya said, her breath hitching slightly. Preston Sterling made a move, and it is bad. I opened my laptop and navigated to the most prominent political gossip and news blog in the city. My heart went completely still when I saw the massive banner headline plastered across the very top of the homepage. The bold black text read, "Corrupt Deputy District Attorney protects violent father who viciously attacked innocent white socialite." Beneath the explosive headline was a video player, but it was not the crystal-clear 4K security footage I had played at the police station just hours prior. Preston Sterling had used his deep pockets and extensive shady media connections to secure a leaked, heavily edited 2-second clip of the altercation. Someone had deliberately stripped away all the audio, removing the damning sound of Caroline's racist slurs and her unhinged demands for the deed to my father's house. The footage had been maliciously cropped, zoomed in, and manipulated to show only a fraction of a second where my father Harrison had raised his hands defensively to shield his face from the incoming baseball bat. Out of context and carefully edited it, looked exactly like an aggressive, angry older black man, lunging toward a terrified, crying blonde woman who was simply cowering in fear. They had manufactured a perfect visual lie specifically designed to trigger every single historical racial bias and prejudice in the public consciousness. The comments under the video were already in the tens of thousands, and they were absolutely brutal to read. Anonymous users were calling for my immediate resignation from the prosecutor's office, demanding that my dangerous father be locked away in a maximum security prison forever, and praising Caroline as a brave, heroic survivor of unprovoked, senseless violence. The media spin was a highly calculated, targeted hit meant to completely derail my entire life and shift the narrative away from Caroline's actual crimes. What the Sterling family knew, and what my brother Andre was banking on, was the fact that I was currently the leading candidate for a massive career-defining promotion. In less than a month, the state governor was scheduled to officially appoint the new state attorney general, and I was widely known to be his top choice for the position. I had spent 10 grueling years building an impeccable, flawless reputation in the criminal justice system, working twice as hard as any of my peers. I had sacrificed romantic relationships, sleep, and personal comfort to prove that a black woman from a working-class background could rise to the very top of the legal food chain without compromising her morals or playing dirty politics. This media leak was explicitly designed to trigger a political scandal so massive and so toxic that the governor would have absolutely no choice but to distance himself from me to save his own administration. The Sterlings were weaponizing public opinion and internet outrage, threatening to destroy my entire career and my father's remaining dignity simply to protect their own corrupt interests and keep Caroline out of a prison jumpsuit. As I sat at my desk watching the fabricated video loop over and over again, feeling a mix of disgust and fascination at their audacity, my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller ID displayed my brother Andres' name. I accepted the call, putting it on speakerphone, and sitting back in my chair, letting him speak first. Andre did not sound panicked or afraid anymore. Instead, he sounded incredibly smug, his voice dripping with triumphant, unearned arrogance. "Did you see the morning news, Naomi?" he asked, letting out a dark, mocking chuckle that made my skin crawl. My father-in-law is a very powerful man, and his family essentially owns the local media syndicates in this city. They have reporters, editors, and prominent bloggers on their direct payroll who will print whatever narrative Preston Sterling tells them to print without asking a single question. "You thought you could just use your little badge to ruin my life and put my beautiful wife in a cage, but you forgot how the real world operates," Andre continued, completely blinded by his own toxic ego. "The real world runs on perception, and right now, the entire world perceives your precious father as a violent monster." I remained perfectly silent, allowing him to dig his own grave with his words. Andre took my silence as a sign of submission and defeat, and his ego inflated even further. "Here is what is going to happen now, Naomi." My brother commanded, his tone completely ruthless and devoid of any familial loyalty. "You are going to drop all the charges against Caroline immediately and publicly apologize for the misunderstanding. Then you are going to bring Dad to my corporate office and force him to sign the deed to the house over to me by noon today. If you do exactly what I say, Preston will make a few phone calls, and that video will miraculously disappear from the internet within the hour. The bloggers will issue a retraction citing a mix-up, and your precious little reputation will survive this scandal. You can go on to be Attorney General and play the hero. But if you refuse to cooperate," Andre threatened, his voice dropping into a vicious sneer, "my in-laws will ensure that video runs on every single national news network before dinner time. They will hire pundits to completely destroy your career. You will lose your only chance at the promotion you have wanted your whole life, and Dad will be publicly crucified as a violent predator. They will drag his name through the mud until he is a pariah in his own city. Make the smart choice for once in your life, Naomi, and just do it for the family. Secure the bag and let the old man take the fall so the rest of us can thrive." I listened to my brother's ultimatum, feeling a profound sense of pity for how completely brainwashed he had become by his desperate pursuit of white validation and elite status. "You really think a 2-second edited video is enough to make me betray my own father and compromise everything I have built?" I asked, my voice eerily calm and entirely unshaken by his threats. "You are about to learn a very painful, permanent lesson about what real power actually looks like, Andre." I hung up the phone before he could say another word, cutting off his arrogant laughter and tossing my phone onto the desk. I was not going to negotiate with emotional terrorists. And I certainly was not going to let a group of elitist frauds intimidate me into dropping legitimate felony charges against a woman who nearly beat my father to death. But the situation was escalating far faster than I had initially anticipated, and the political fallout was already beginning to manifest. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was an official urgent notification from the internal secure network of the district attorney's office. My boss, the district attorney of the entire county, had just summoned me to his private office for an immediate mandatory meeting. When I arrived at the municipal building 30 minutes later, shifted. The usually bustling hallways were buzzing with nervous whispers and side glances from paralegals and junior prosecutors. People I had mentored and worked alongside for years were actively avoiding making eye contact with me as I walked past their cubicles. The court of public opinion was already holding its trial, and the verdict was leaning heavily against me. I kept my posture perfectly straight, ignoring the murmurs as I walked straight into the executive suite. I entered the expansive corner office without knocking. The district attorney was standing behind his heavy solid oak desk, looking gravely concerned and deeply exhausted. He had been my mentor, pushing me toward the attorney general nomination and championing my career. But right now, he looked like a man evaluating a massive political liability. He did not greet me or offer me a seat. Instead, he slowly turned a digital tablet toward me, sliding it across the polished surface of his desk. The viral edited video of my father was playing on a continuous loop on his screen, the silent footage repeating the same fabricated lie over and over again in the quiet room. The district attorney looked up at me with heavy, tired eyes, the weight of the impending political storm pressing down on both of our shoulders. "The media is calling my office every 5 minutes, demanding a statement about your involvement in a cover-up," he said, his voice flat and serious. "The governor's office just reached out to express their extreme hesitation regarding your nomination. This is a complete public relations nightmare, Naomi, and it threatens to tear down the integrity of this entire department. I need you to tell me exactly what is going on, and I need to know if this situation is going to force me to ask for your immediate resignation before the press destroys us both." I stood completely still, absorbing the full magnitude of his words and the incredible danger that my brother and the Sterling family had deliberately placed me in. I looked directly into the district attorney's eyes, refusing to break contact or show even a fraction of the fear they expected me to feel. "I am not resigning," I said, my voice perfectly steady and resonant in the quiet office. "If I resign right now, I validate their fabricated narrative, and I allow a violent criminal to destroy the integrity of this office simply because she has enough money to buy a headline." I told him about the 4K security footage, about the forged medical documents signed by a disgraced felon, and about the blatant weaponization of racial bias that the Sterling family was currently using to shield themselves from justice. The district attorney listened intently, his expression shifting from deep political concern to a hardened, quiet fury as he realized the media had manipulated his department. "You have 1 hour, Naomi," he finally said, leaning heavily on his desk. "I will authorize a press conference on the main courthouse steps, but you better deliver an absolute knockout blow, because if you fail to clear our name today, you will not have a career left by tomorrow morning." I walked out of the executive suite and immediately pulled out my phone, dialing my assistant Maya. The media was already swarming the courthouse plaza like sharks smelling blood in the water. I told Maya to set up the largest digital display screen we had in the evidence department and place it directly behind the main podium. I also instructed her to make a few very specific phone calls to the local community centers and the public school district, where my father had spent 40 years of his life teaching history. Preston Sterling thought he could erase 4 decades of my father's impeccable legacy with a 2-second silent video clip. I was going to remind the entire city exactly who Harrison was, and I was going to do it on live television. I needed the people who actually knew my father to stand behind him and show the world that his life amounted to far more than a racist stereotype created by a desperate family of frauds. By noon, the courthouse steps were absolutely packed with news vans, reporters, and aggressive political bloggers, all waiting to watch my public downfall. They held their microphones like weapons, ready to tear me apart the second I stepped out of the heavy brass doors. I did not wear my usual soft, neutral tones. I wore a sharp structured dark suit projecting absolute unyielding authority. When I stepped up to the podium, the barrage of camera flashes was blinding, and the shouting questions blended into a chaotic, deafening roar. Deputy Chief, why are you protecting a violent predator? One reporter yelled over the crowd. Are you stepping down from the Attorney General nomination? Another shouted, trying to shove a microphone right into my face. Their eagerness to destroy me was palpable, a hungry collective energy that I had seen destroy many innocent lives before. I raised my hand, and the sheer commanding presence of my gesture caused the chaotic shouting to slowly die down into a tense, expectant silence. I looked out over the sea of journalists, feeling a cold, focused energy settling over my entire body. This morning, many of you published a heavily manipulated 2-second video clip designed to destroy the life of an innocent black elder. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone and echoing across the crowded plaza. You rushed to criminalize a 65-year-old retired teacher without verifying the source, without asking a single question, and without giving the accused any benefit of the doubt, simply because the accuser was a wealthy, crying white socialite. You allowed yourselves to become pawns in a malicious public relations strategy manufactured by a family that is currently trying to hide their own heinous crimes. The reporters shifted uncomfortably, sensing the aggressive shift in my tone. I did not come out here to offer a defensive apology or hand over my resignation to satisfy a corrupt narrative. I continued scanning the faces of the journalists who had already written my professional obituary. I came out here to show you what absolute truth looks like and to expose the violent, malicious fraud that Preston Sterling and his daughter Caroline have attempted to perpetrate against the justice system of this city. They believed their money and their proximity to whiteness would automatically buy them an exemption from the law, but they made a catastrophic mistake when they tried to frame a man in my jurisdiction. I gestured to Maya, who hit a button on her remote. The massive screen behind me flickered to life, and the full, unedited security footage from my father's study began to play. This time there was full audio. The crisp, clear sound of Caroline's voice echoed across the plaza as she screamed at my father, demanding the deed to his historic home so she could fund her lavish lifestyle. The reporters watched in stunned, absolute silence as the true events unfolded before their very eyes. They watched Caroline pick up the heavy ceramic vase and intentionally smash it into her own forehead to create the fake injury. The crowd gasped collectively as Caroline grabbed the vintage baseball bat and viciously struck my gentle, unarmed father in the knee and the head while he was pleading for peace. And then they saw my brother Andre step into the frame. They watched him stare at his bleeding, unconscious father before coldly dialing 911 to frame him. The pure, undeniable brutality of the footage completely shattered the fake narrative the Sterlings had bought and paid for. The journalists, who had been practically salivating for my ruin, were now staring at the screen with their mouths hanging open, furiously typing notes, as they realized they had been deliberately manipulated into participating in a massive criminal cover-up. The shock rippling through the plaza was a physical force, replacing their prior hostility with a profound sense of horror and professional embarrassment. But I was not finished completely dismantling their false reality. I stepped aside and allowed a steady stream of people to walk up the courthouse steps to stand firmly behind me. These were not expensive lawyers or paid public relations experts. These were the people whose lives my father had personally touched over the past 40 years. A prominent community leader stepped forward, taking the microphone. He spoke passionately about how my father had personally mentored him, keeping him out of gang violence when he was just a desperate teenager with nowhere else to turn. A local judge, who had once been my father's student, spoke about Harrison's gentle, patient nature and his unwavering dedication to his community. They shared stories of a man who brought groceries to struggling families, who stayed late to tutor failing students, and who built a legacy of Black excellence that did not rely on tearing others down to succeed. I took the microphone back, looking out at the cameras with a fierce, unwavering gaze. What you saw this morning was not journalism, I stated clearly, my words cutting through the cool afternoon air. It was the weaponization of white tears, designed to trigger systemic racial bias and protect a violent predator from facing the consequences of her own horrific actions. Caroline Sterling believed that her privilege would automatically shield her from justice. She believed that society would always blindly trust a crying white woman over a bleeding black man regardless of the actual evidence. Today we prove her wrong, and today we hold every single person who participated in this malicious defamation fully accountable under the full extent of the law. There will be no backroom deals, and there will be no quiet settlements. The atmosphere in the plaza completely inverted in a matter of seconds. The aggressive hostile energy directed at me was instantly redirected toward the Sterling family and their corrupt media contacts. Reporters were already shouting into their phones, demanding their editors pull the fabricated story and issue immediate massive retractions. Social media feeds began exploding in real time as the unedited footage hit the internet, spreading like absolute wildfire. The public backlash against Caroline and her parents was swift, brutal, and entirely unforgiving. People who had been demanding my resignation just minutes ago were now calling for Caroline to be locked in federal prison for attempted murder. The hashtag defending Harrison began trending worldwide, completely erasing the toxic narrative my brother had tried to build. The media spin they had so carefully orchestrated had turned into a catastrophic public relations nightmare that would consume their entire family. I stepped away from the podium, ignoring the frantic questions being shouted by the journalists who were now desperately trying to get on my good side. I walked back through the heavy brass doors of the courthouse, feeling the profound, heavy satisfaction of securing justice for the only parent who had ever truly loved me. The air conditioning of the lobby washed over me, cooling my skin after the intense pressure of the press conference. I had protected my department, I had protected my father's legacy, and I had completely destroyed the false narrative they tried to hang around my neck. But the battle was not entirely over yet. As I walked across the polished marble floor of the courthouse lobby, I saw them waiting for me near the security checkpoint. Preston Sterling and my brother Andre were standing there, their faces twisted with an ugly, desperate rage. Preston's expensive suit looked slightly rumpled and his face was bright red with explosive fury. He had clearly been watching the press conference on his phone, and he knew that his family's pristine reputation had just been publicly obliterated beyond all possible repair. His carefully constructed empire of social superiority was currently trending on the internet as a prime example of racial manipulation and criminal violence. Andre looked like a trapped animal pacing back and forth next to his father-in-law, running his hands over his head in a state of absolute frantic terror. When they saw me approaching, they marched forward, completely blocking my path to the elevators. Their body language was aggressive, trying to physically intimidate me one last time, but I simply stopped walking, keeping a comfortable, safe distance between us. I looked at them with the detached, analytical stare of a prosecutor evaluating two men who were about to lose absolutely everything. "You think you won?" Preston sneered, his voice shaking with a terrifying, uncontrollable anger that echoed loudly in the cavernous lobby. "You think playing that video makes you untouchable? You just humiliated my family on national television and you think you can just walk away without consequences." "I did not humiliate your family, Preston," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion, refusing to give him the reaction he craved. "Your daughter humiliated your family when she decided to violently attack an elderly man and then lie about it to the police. I simply provided the public with the correct lighting to see her true colors. You cannot blame me for the ugly reality that was hiding behind her tears." Preston took an aggressive step forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, a desperate attempt to reclaim some fraction of his lost authority. "I am pulling the $10 million funding from Andre's company today," Preston threatened loudly, not caring who in the lobby heard him. "I am liquidating every single asset we tied to his pathetic little startup. You just bankrupted your own brother, Naomi. You destroyed his entire life just to prove a point to the media. And as soon as my lawyers finish drafting the paperwork, I am suing you and your entire department for criminal defamation. I will tie you up in court for the rest of your miserable life until you are begging on your knees to settle." Andre stepped up right beside Preston, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and sheer panic. "Look what you did, Naomi," Andre yelled, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his crumbling reality. "They were our only tickets to the top and you ruined it. You just flushed $10 million down the drain because you wanted to play the hero for Dad. You ruined us completely, and there is no way coming back from this. I stood there in the quiet echo of the marble lobby, absorbing their pathetic threats and their desperate attempts to maintain control over a situation they had already completely lost. They still truly believed they held the ultimate financial power. They still thought their money was the most dangerous weapon in the room, and that pulling their funding would bring me to my knees in sorrow for my brother. They had absolutely no idea what was coming next, and I was going to enjoy watching their entire house of cards burn to ash. I stood completely still, letting Preston's empty threats echo off the cold marble walls of the courthouse lobby. Before I could even formulate a response to his pathetic intimidation tactics, the heavy brass doors behind them swung violently open. My mother Yvonne rushed into the lobby, her expensive trench coat flapping behind her like the wings of a desperate, panicked bird. She had clearly been watching the press conference from the street, and the reality of her shattered social climbing dreams had finally caught up to her. Her face was a mask of absolute unhinged fury, and her eyes locked onto me with a level of hatred that no mother should ever hold for her own child. "Naomi, what have you done?" Yvonne screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical screech that made several passing security guards stop and stare. "You ruined us," she wailed, throwing her hands up in the air in a theatrical display of pure misery. "You just went on national television and destroyed your brother's entire Black excellence empire. The Sterlings were our ticket to the top, Naomi. They were our only way into the elite society. We have worked so hard to join, and you just burned it all to the ground because you wanted to play the hero for that useless old man." I watched my mother hyperventilating in the middle of the courthouse lobby, completely ignoring the fact that the useless old man she was referring to was her husband of 40 years, who was currently lying in a hospital bed with a shattered knee and a severe concussion. She did not care about his pain or his suffering. She only cared about the imaginary high society invitations and the country club memberships she thought Caroline and her wealthy white parents were going to hand to her. She had sold her soul and her family for a seat at a table that was never actually going to welcome her. "You were always jealous of Andre." My mother continued sobbing aggressively as she moved closer to my brother, trying to shield him from my calm, calculating gaze. "You could not stand the fact that he was the successful one, the golden boy who married into real wealth and pedigree. So you used your little government job to launch a malicious vendetta against his innocent wife. You just cost him $10 million, Naomi. You bankrupted your own brother out of pure bitter spite." Preston Sterling stood slightly behind my mother, nodding his head in arrogant agreement, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit. "That is exactly right," Preston sneered, his face still flushed with residual anger from the press conference. "You let your petty family jealousy cloud your professional judgment, and now you are going to pay the ultimate price when I ruin your career and pull every single cent of funding from your brother's company." I let them rant and rave, absorbing their toxic venom without flinching. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of the emotional devastation they were desperately trying to provoke. Instead, I slowly reached down and unclasped the twin silver locks on my sleek leather briefcase. The sharp mechanical clicks echoed loudly in the tense space, instantly drawing their attention. I placed the briefcase onto a nearby marble bench, opening it with deliberate, meticulous care. "Ticket to the top?" I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register that forced them to lean in and listen. I reached inside the briefcase and pulled out a massive, thick dossier binding together hundreds of pages of highly confidential financial records, bank statements, and tax documents. "You really think these people are your ticket to the top, Mother?" I took a slow step forward, holding the heavy dossier in my hands, looking directly into Yvonne's panicked eyes. "The Sterlings are not your ticket to elite society, Mother." I stated my words, cutting through her hysterical delusions like a razor blade. "The Sterlings are completely bankrupt." The entire lobby went dead silent. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from Preston Sterling's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He took a sudden step backward, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he stared at the thick dossier in my hands. My mother froze, her tears drying up instantly as she looked back and forth between me and Preston, trying to process the impossible words I had just spoken. Andre let out a nervous, shaky laugh, shaking his head in rapid denial. "What are you talking about, Naomi?" Andre stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "That is ridiculous. Preston is a billionaire. His family has old money. They own real estate all over the country." I turned my gaze to my brother, feeling a profound sense of pity for how easily he had been manipulated by his own desperate pursuit of white validation. "They do not own anything, Andre," I said calmly, flipping open the heavy dossier and pulling out a certified bank statement, highlighting the damning red numbers for him to see. "They lost their entire fortune 3 years ago in a massive real estate Ponzi scheme that completely collapsed. The custom suits, the mink coats, the luxury cars. It is all leased or bought on massive high-interest credit lines that are currently defaulting. They are drowning in millions of dollars of insurmountable debt." Preston lunged forward, trying to snatch the documents out of my hands, but I quickly stepped back, letting a nearby courthouse security guard step between us. "You are lying!" Preston shouted wildly, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Those documents are fabricated. You are just trying to slander us to save your own skin." "These are certified federal tax records, Preston," I replied, projecting my voice so the security guards and passing clerks could hear exactly what kind of fraud was standing in their lobby. "Your bank accounts have been overdrawn for months. You have 3 properties actively facing foreclosure, and your primary business license was suspended last year for tax evasion. You have absolutely nothing left but a fake reputation and a desperate need for liquid cash." My mother gripped Andre's arm so tightly, her knuckles turned white. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in violent denial. "No, that cannot be true. Caroline comes from an elite family. They were going to invest $10 million into Andre's startup today. They never had $10 million to invest." "Mother," I explained slowly, ensuring every single word shattered her pathetic social climbing dreams. "They targeted Andre because they saw a desperate, insecure black man who was obsessed with proximity to whiteness. They knew he would be the perfect gullible puppet for their criminal enterprise. They have been using your precious Golden Boys startup company as an illegal front to apply for minority-owned business, diversity grants, and to funnel dirty money through offshore shell accounts to evade the Internal Revenue Service." Andre looked like he had been physically struck in the chest. He stumbled backward, hitting the cold marble wall and sliding down slightly as his legs refused to support his weight. "You are lying," he gasped, clutching his stomach. "Caroline loves me. Her family believes in my vision. They arranged the investors for me." "They arranged a massive federal crime for you, Andre," I corrected him coldly, flipping to the next section of the dossier and pulling out an array of highlighted property deeds and loan applications. "And when their illegal shell games started falling apart, when the dangerous people they owed money to started demanding immediate payment, they needed a massive influx of untraceable liquid cash to save their own skins. They needed exactly $3 million to pay off their mafia debts before the end of the week." I looked directly at Preston, whose eyes were now darting desperately toward the exit, clearly calculating if he could make a run for it before the authorities arrived. But Preston was completely trapped, and he knew it. I turned my attention back to my mother, watching the horrific realization slowly dawn on her face. "Do you understand now, Mother?" I asked, my voice dripping with absolute contempt for her willful ignorance. "They did not attack Dad because he was losing his mind. They attacked him because he stubbornly refused to sign over the deed to his historic $3 million Victorian estate. Caroline tried to beat an elderly man to death and frame him for assault so that Andre could secure emergency power of attorney and immediately liquidate the property. They were going to let your faithful husband rot in a maximum security psychiatric ward just so they could steal his house and pay off their own shady criminal debts. And your perfect, successful golden boy stood right there in the doorway and let it happen because he was too desperate for their fake elite approval to protect his own flesh and blood." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hung heavily in the freezing air of the courthouse lobby. My mother let out a strangled, horrific gasp, clapping both hands over her mouth as she stared at Preston Sterling with wide, terrified eyes. She had spent 10 years treating me like absolute garbage simply because I refused to play along with her superficial obsession with status. She had thrown away her daughter and abandoned her bleeding husband, all to appease a family of broke, racist criminals who were actively planning to destroy her entire life. Yvonne slowly turned to look at Andre, her eyes pleading for him to deny the evidence I had just laid out before them. "Tell me she is lying." Andre, my mother whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Tell me Caroline did not use you. Tell me we are not losing everything." But Andre was completely spiraling into a severe psychological break. His entire identity was entirely wrapped up in being a successful tech CEO who had married into white wealth. Facing the reality that he was nothing more than a useful idiot for a bankrupt criminal family was completely shattering his fragile mind. He started shaking his head back and forth, running his hands violently through his hair as he stared at the marble floor. "No," Andre muttered quietly at first, and then louder as the denial took full control of his crumbling sanity. "No, you are wrong, Naomi. You are just a bitter dropout trying to ruin my life because you are jealous. You do not know anything about business or investments. You just make up lies to tear me down." He pushed himself off the wall, standing up straight and pointing a shaking finger at my face. He let out a loud, sudden burst of hysterical laughter that echoed wildly through the lobby, making the nearby security guards reach nervously for their radios. "You think you figured it all out?" Andre laughed, his eyes wide and unhinged. "You think you proved that they are broke and I am ruined. But you are wrong, Naomi. You are completely, utterly wrong." I closed the dossier quietly, waiting for his inevitable delusional defense. "And why is that, Andre?" I asked, maintaining my absolute calm exterior. "Because they are not my main investors anymore," Andre shouted, practically spitting the words at me in his desperate frenzy to hold on to his shattered reality. "Caroline and her parents were just the brokers, Naomi. They are not the ones putting up the $10 million today. The money is coming from a real institutional investor, a massive anonymous venture capital firm that believes in my revolutionary tech platform." He took a step toward me, his chest puffed out again, wrapping himself in his false armor of corporate success. "I do not need Dad's stupid rundown house," Naomi. Andre sneered, his voice dripping with pure arrogant delusion. "I do not care if the Sterlings are broke, and I certainly do not need you or your pathetic little government job to protect me. The major investment deal is already signed and sealed." My mother looked up, a tiny glimmer of desperate hope returning to her tear-stained face as she desperately clung to her son's confident words. "Yes," Yvonne babbled, wiping her eyes quickly. "Andre's company is brilliant. He has real investors backing him up. We do not need the Sterlings, and we certainly do not need your fake documents, Naomi." Andre smirked, looking at me as if I were a peasant who had just been completely outsmarted by a master businessman. "Apex Capital," Andre declared loudly, saying the name of the venture capital firm like it was a magical spell that would save his life. "Apex Capital is my lead investor, Naomi. They are the most ruthless, exclusive, anonymous private equity fund in the entire state. The CEO of Apex Capital loved my pitch and personally approved the wire transfer. The $10 million is hitting my corporate bank account tomorrow morning, right when the banks open." He let out another loud, hysterical laugh, throwing his arms wide open as if embracing his imaginary victory. "I am going to be a multi-millionaire tomorrow," Naomi. Andre shouted, his voice echoing through the massive courthouse lobby. "My company is going to be untouchable. I do not need the house, I do not need Dad, and I definitely do not need you. You can take your little evidence folder and shove it, because tomorrow morning Apex Capital is going to make me a king, and you will still just be a sad, lonely dropout." I watched my brother raving like a lunatic in the middle of the public lobby, completely detached from reality. He was clinging to the name of his supposed savior with the desperate, fervent energy of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. Apex Capital. The name sounded so incredibly impressive, rolling off his tongue. He had clearly spent months bragging to his country club friends and his fake elite associates about securing funding from such a mysterious, powerful entity. He truly believed that this faceless corporate giant was going to swoop in, save his failing startup, and elevate him to the billionaire status he felt he inherently deserved. Preston Sterling, who had been quietly inching his way toward the exit doors, suddenly stopped walking. He looked at Andre with a mix of confusion and lingering arrogance. Preston knew he had used Andre as a pawn, but even Preston seemed slightly relieved that his son-in-law might actually have an independent source of massive funding. If the tech company received $10 million tomorrow, Preston likely calculated he could still find a way to manipulate Andre and siphon off enough money to pay the mafia debts before they came to break his legs. The greed in Preston's eyes reignited, replacing the sheer terror from moments ago. "See?" Preston said, smoothing down his lapels and trying to regain some fraction of his shattered dignity. "The boy is a genius. We simply connected him with the right people in the industry. Our family opened the doors for him to pitch to Apex Capital. We might have some temporary cash flow issues, Deputy Chief, but our social capital is still incredibly valuable. Andre is going to be massively successful, and Caroline will be right there beside him as his loving, supportive wife. You cannot stop progress, Naomi." My mother nodded furiously, stepping away from Preston and moving closer to Andre, her entire loyalty immediately shifting to whoever she believed held the most money and power at that exact second. She reached out and stroked Andre's arm, looking at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. "My beautiful, brilliant son," Yvonne cooed, ignoring the fact that her brilliant son had just tried to lock her husband in an asylum. "You are going to show them all, Andre. You are going to take that Apex Capital money and build an empire. We do not need this bitter, jealous girl trying to tear our family apart with her fake investigations." I stood perfectly still, holding my sleek leather briefcase, allowing the three of them to revel in their shared collective delusion. They had formed a pathetic circle of denial, desperately validating each other's lies to avoid facing the horrific reality of their absolute moral and financial bankruptcy. Andre was breathing heavily, a manic smile plastered across his face as he stared at me, waiting for me to bow down to his supreme business acumen. He expected me to look defeated, to look angry, or to look jealous that he had supposedly secured such an incredibly massive financial victory, despite my attempts to expose his fraud. But I did not look defeated. I looked at my brother with a cold, clinical fascination, observing the exact moment before a man's entire existence is completely permanently eradicated. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of superiority, wrapping himself in the false security of a $10 million wire transfer that he believed was coming to save him. He was standing at the very peak of his imaginary mountain, looking down at me with absolute contempt, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was already entirely gone. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the chaotic noise of the courthouse lobby fade into the background as I prepared to deliver the final devastating blow that would end his life as he knew it. I watched my brother standing there in the expansive marble lobby of the courthouse, completely consumed by his own manufactured delusion. Andre was panting heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive tailored suit as he clung desperately to the imaginary lifeline of Apex Capital. He truly believed that this faceless corporate entity was going to swoop down from the heavens tomorrow morning and deposit $10 million into his fraudulent tech startup, saving him from the catastrophic reality I had just exposed. My mother Yvonne was standing right beside him, her eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate hope. She had instantly pivoted back to worshipping her golden boy the second he mentioned the possibility of incoming wealth. Preston Sterling was also watching Andre with a renewed sense of predatory calculation, clearly plotting how he could siphon off that incoming venture capital money to pay his mafia debts before they came to break his legs. They were all standing in a pathetic circle of shared delusion, completely blind to the absolute destruction that was staring them right in the face. Andre let out another loud, arrogant laugh, clapping his hands together as if he had just won the lottery. "You cannot touch me, Naomi," my brother boasted, his voice echoing loudly off the polished stone walls, drawing the attention of several passing paralegals and security guards. Apex Capital is the most exclusive private equity fund in this entire state. They manage billions of dollars in assets, and their anonymous CEO personally reviewed my business model and approved my Series B funding round. They do not care about some stupid family drama over a broken-down house, and they certainly do not care about your pathetic little fake investigations. Tomorrow morning, when the banks open, the wire transfer will hit my corporate accounts, and I will be completely untouchable. I will buy 10 houses just like Dad's, and I will not let you or him anywhere near them. I let his frantic, arrogant words hang in the freezing air of the lobby, allowing him to build his imaginary pedestal as high as it could possibly go. The higher he climbed in his own mind, the more devastating the impact would be when I shattered the ground beneath his feet. I slowly uncrossed my arms and took a deliberate, measured step forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing just inches away from my brother. The manic, triumphant smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as he looked into my eyes, expecting to see defeat or jealousy, but finding only an endless, bottomless void of absolute pity. "Andre," I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that completely commanded the chaotic space around us. "Who exactly do you think owns Apex Capital?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on the entire group. Andre's arrogant smile slowly completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden flickering look of intense confusion. He blinked several times, looking at me as if I had just spoken to him in a foreign language. "What kind of stupid question is that?" Andre scoffed, crossing his arms defensively over his chest, though his hands were noticeably trembling now. "The founder and CEO is a private billionaire investor. They value their anonymity because they are too powerful and too busy making massive global market moves to deal with the public eye. They saw my genius, and they chose to back my vision because they know a unicorn tech company when they see one." I tilted my head slightly, observing him with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist studying a microscopic insect. "You are absolutely right about the anonymity, Andre," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly smooth and unhurried. "The founder of Apex Capital deliberately structured the firm using multiple layers of blind trusts and offshore holding companies specifically designed to keep their true identity entirely hidden from the public and the media. It is an incredibly complex legal framework that requires a profound, masterful understanding of corporate law and the criminal justice system to maintain perfectly without ever triggering a single regulatory audit." Preston Sterling took a sudden nervous step backward, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray as my words began to slowly penetrate his thick skull. He was a corrupt businessman who understood how shell companies worked, and he was finally beginning to understand the horrifying reality of what I was actually saying. My mother Yvonne looked back and forth between me and Andre, her frantic mind completely unable to process the shifting power dynamic in the room. "You see," Andre, I continued, taking another slow step forward, forcing him to retreat until his back hit the cold marble pillar behind him. "10 years ago, when Mother threw me out of the house into the freezing winter night with absolutely nothing to my name, I had to make a choice. I could either let your toxic elitist expectations destroy me, or I could use my full-ride scholarship in criminal law to understand exactly how power and wealth are truly accumulated and protected in this country. While you were busy spending Mom's money on country club memberships and fake designer watches, trying desperately to impress white socialites who secretly hated you, I was studying the exact financial loopholes that those same billionaires use to hide their fortunes. I watched the absolute sheer terror begin to bloom deep inside my brother's eyes, as his brain desperately fought against the impossible truth that was actively crashing down upon him. "No," Andre whispered, his voice cracking pitifully as he shook his head back and forth in rapid, violent denial. "No, that is impossible. You are a dropout. You work for the city. You are just a government employee making a basic salary. You do not know anything about private equity or venture capital." I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out a sleek black titanium business card. It was completely blank, except for a single embossed silver logo in the direct center, a minimalist geometric mountain peak representing Apex Capital. I held the heavy metal card between two fingers and gently tapped it against my brother's chest, right over his rapidly beating heart. "I am not just a deputy chief district attorney," Andre, I stated with chilling, absolute authority, every single word striking him like a physical blow. I used my legal expertise and the connections I made prosecuting corrupt financial executives to quietly launch an anonymous investment fund. While everyone in this pathetic family thought I was a struggling failure working dead-end jobs, I was actually using my massive early returns on tech investments to build an empire from the shadows. I am the founder, the sole owner, and the anonymous chief executive officer of Apex Capital. The silence that followed my declaration was so absolute and so profound that it felt like the entire world had simply stopped spinning. The heavy brass doors of the courthouse lobby remained shut. The passing security guards seemed to freeze in place, and the air itself became thick and suffocating. Andre stared at the black titanium card in my hand, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of pure, unadulterated horror. His eyes rolled back slightly as the catastrophic realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. The untouchable billionaire savior he had been praying to, the massive, faceless corporate entity that he believed was going to rescue his entire life and elevate him to the highest ranks of society, was the very same sister he had been calling a ghetto dropout for the past decade. My mother. Yvonne let out a horrific, strangled gasp that sounded like a dying animal. She clutched her chest, stumbling backward and falling heavily against the nearest wooden bench. Her entire worldview, her entire identity built on the foundation of chasing wealth and status, had just been completely, permanently shattered. The daughter she had thrown into the street, the child she had verbally abused and treated like human garbage, was secretly the billionaire elite she had spent her entire miserable life trying to desperately impress. The absolute crushing weight of her colossal mistake broke her mind right there in the lobby, leaving her sobbing and gasping for air as she stared at me with terrified, worshipping eyes. Preston Sterling looked like he was about to suffer a massive, fatal heart attack. His face was covered in a thick layer of cold sweat, and his hands were shaking violently. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that not only was the $10 million bailout money completely gone, but the person who controlled that money was also the top prosecutor in the city, who already had a massive dossier containing every single detail of his mafia debts and his money laundering schemes. He was completely trapped with absolutely no way out. "You are lying," Andre screamed suddenly, his voice echoing shrilly off the marble ceiling, a pathetic, desperate attempt to reject reality. "You are just trying to scare me. You could not possibly own Apex. They approved my business model. They sent me the term sheets last week. They gave me a $2 million seed round last year. You would never have given me that money." I looked at my brother, feeling a profound sense of dominant calm wash over me. "I gave you that seed money, Andre," I replied, my voice dropping into a cold, ruthless cadence. "I instructed my asset managers to approve your initial $2 million funding round because despite everything you and Mother did to me, I still naively thought you were trying to build a legitimate business. I wanted to give my own brother a genuine chance at building real Black excellence without having to rely on the fake approval of racist elites. I sat in my office and read your prospectus, and I signed the wire transfer myself, giving you the capital you needed to succeed." I stepped even closer to him, my eyes narrowing into a fierce, lethal glare. But then my financial auditors started tracking where my $2 million actually went. I watched you funnel my clean venture capital money directly into Preston Sterling's offshore shell accounts. I watched you use my money to pay for Caroline's designer clothes and your fake luxury lifestyle while you let your own father sit in a house with a leaking roof. And then today, I watched you stand in the doorway of a study and do absolutely nothing while your entitled white wife beat the man who raised us with a baseball bat. You took my money and you used it to destroy our family. Andre was physically shaking now, tears of pure absolute panic streaming down his face. His chest was heaving, and he looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop beneath him. "Naomi, please," Andre begged, his arrogant facade completely melting away into pathetic, cowardly submission. "Please, you cannot do this. The paperwork is already signed for the Series B funding. The $10 million is legally promised to me. You cannot just take it away. My entire company will collapse today if that money does not arrive tomorrow. I will be completely ruined." I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal cell phone, unlocking the screen with deliberate, terrifying precision. I navigated to my contacts and dialed a number, placing the phone on speaker and holding it up so the entire lobby could hear the ringtone echoing in the quiet space. After 2 rings, a crisp, professional voice answered the line. Apex Capital Executive Office. This is Marcus speaking. How can I help you? Chief? The voice asked clearly and loudly. Marcus. I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any mercy. I need you to immediately execute a complete total cancellation of the $10 million Series B funding wire transfer scheduled for tomorrow morning regarding Andres Tech startup. Pull all associated term sheets and revoke all outstanding letters of intent instantly. Understood, Chief. Marcus replied without a single second of hesitation, the sound of rapid keyboard typing echoing through the speaker. The Series B funding has been officially canceled, and the wire transfer authorization is permanently revoked. Is there anything else? Yes, there is. I continued staring dead into Andre's wide, terrified eyes as I delivered the absolute final execution order. Initiate the immediate recall clause on the initial $2 million seed investment we provided to his company last year. Cite a gross, undeniable breach of the morality clause and clear evidence of criminal financial misconduct and money laundering. Freeze all of their corporate accounts immediately and dispatch our aggressive litigation team to seize any remaining assets tied to that startup by the end of the business hour today. It is done, Chief. Marcus confirmed, his voice cold and efficient. The recall notice has been sent to their banking institutions, and all of their corporate accounts are currently being frozen as we speak. The legal team is moving to seize the assets now. Thank you, Marcus, I said before ending the call and sliding the phone smoothly back into my coat pocket. For one agonizing, perfectly silent second, nobody in the lobby moved. And then the absolute catastrophe struck. Andre's expensive smartphone, which was securely tucked inside his tailored suit jacket, began to vibrate violently. It buzzed once, then twice, and then a continuous, non-stop flood of incoming notifications began to sound. He scrambled desperately to pull the phone out, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the marble floor. The screen was completely lit up with endless streams of catastrophic financial alerts. Automated text messages from his primary business banking institution, informing him that his accounts were indefinitely locked, pending a massive fraud investigation. Urgent, frantic emails from his chief financial officer screaming that their payroll accounts had just been drained and that investors were pulling out of the company in a massive, coordinated panic. His entire corporate empire, his whole fake identity built on lies and stolen money, was literally evaporating into absolute nothingness in a matter of mere seconds, right there in the palm of his hands. No, 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 Andre chanted repeatedly, staring at the cascading notifications on his screen, his voice rising into a high-pitched, hysterical wail. My company, my money, it is all gone. It is all completely gone. You bankrupted me, Naomi. You destroyed everything I have. He dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably, completely stripped of his pride, his wealth, and his golden boy status. Yvonne sat on the nearby bench, covering her face with her hands, weeping loudly as she watched her precious son lose absolutely everything, recognizing that her chance at entering high society was permanently dead. Preston Sterling was clutching his chest, breathing heavily, as the reality of his impending mafia debts and federal prison sentence crashed down upon him. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the heavy brass exit doors. Caroline, who had secretly been brought down from the holding cell by her expensive, slick lawyer to await the bail hearing, was standing near the back of the lobby. She had clearly been watching the entire exchange unfold, and she had seen the exact moment the $10 million completely vanished. Realizing that the money was permanently gone, that her husband was now completely destitute and bankrupt, and that her powerful elite parents were entirely ruined, Caroline slowly backed away. The fake tears were completely gone from her face, replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. She turned her back on her sobbing husband, her crying mother-in-law, and her terrified parents, and quietly, desperately tried to slip out the back door of the courthouse, completely abandoning them all to their inevitable destruction. I stood tall in the center of the shattered remains of my former family, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute dominance. They had tried to bury me, they had tried to destroy my father, and they had tried to steal from the very hands that secretly fed them. But I was the deputy chief district attorney. I was the CEO of Apex Capital, and I was the one who controlled the entire board. They had played their final hand, and I had just completely, absolutely annihilated them. Caroline had almost made it to the heavy oak doors at the back of the courthouse lobby. Her expensive designer heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor as she desperately tried to distance herself from the catastrophic financial ruin that had just consumed her husband and her parents. She kept her head down, her blonde hair falling forward to hide her face, acting exactly like a cowardly rat abandoning a rapidly sinking ship. She truly believed that if she could just slip quietly through those massive doors, she could hail a private luxury car retreat to a safe five-star hotel, and somehow magically spin this entire absolute disaster to her millions of followers online as a tragic situation she was completely innocent of. I watched her delicate hand reach out to firmly grasp the cold brass handle of the exit door. I did not shout after her or command the armed courthouse security guards to physically stop her. I simply stood there in the very center of the shattered lobby, with my arms crossed tight, and waited for the final trap to spring, completely closed. Caroline pulled the heavy door open, but before she could even take a single desperate step outside into the cool afternoon air, a massive, imposing wall of dark tactical gear completely blocked her forward path. The heavy doors were violently shoved wide open from the outside, forcing Caroline to stumble backward in absolute sheer terror. More than a dozen heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark weather windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their broad chests, swarmed into the expansive courthouse lobby. Their heavy tactical boots hit the polished marble floor with a terrifying coordinated marching rhythm that instantly silenced the pathetic sobbing of my mother and the hysterical, manic hyperventilating of my broken brother. The federal agents moved with swift, lethal precision, immediately establishing a tight, secure perimeter around the entire Trembling Sterling family. Preston Sterling let out a loud, choked gasp, his arrogant face turning completely chalk white as he suddenly realized the absolute finality of his horrific situation. Chloe Sterling dropped her expensive designer handbag, letting her cosmetic items spill across the floor as two stern federal agents moved quickly to flank her sides. Andre remained frozen on his knees, completely paralyzed by the terrifying sight of federal law enforcement invading the previously safe space. Caroline was slowly backing away from the exit door, her chest heaving wildly as she found herself completely surrounded by aggressive agents, with absolutely nowhere left to run and nobody left to emotionally manipulate. They had spent the entire morning focused solely on trying to destroy my political career with heavily edited gossip videos and fake racist news headlines. They had been so incredibly obsessed with winning the superficial court of public opinion that they completely forgot they were actively dealing with the top deputy chief district attorney. While they were busy making frantic, panicked phone calls to bloggers and pulling their fake investments, I had quietly instructed my elite financial crimes division to officially hand over my entire unredacted dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My brilliant team had spent the last several hours working hand in hand with aggressive federal prosecutors to trace every single offshore account, every fake diversity grant application, and every massive wire fraud transaction tied directly to their illegal shell companies. The concrete evidence of their systemic money laundering and their desperate, chaotic attempts to pay off violent mafia debts using my brother's tech startup as a clean front was so overwhelmingly airtight that a severe federal judge had signed the emergency arrest warrants without a single moment of hesitation. The Sterling family was not just facing local assault charges anymore. They were actively facing decades in federal prison for a massive, coordinated racketeering and extortion conspiracy. The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a heavy pair of solid iron handcuffs from his dark utility belt. Preston and Chloe Sterling were immediately detained, their arms forcibly pulled behind their backs as the arresting agents began loudly and clearly reading them, their Miranda rights. Caroline realized she was next on the list, and she instantly defaulted to the only manipulative survival tactic she had ever successfully known. She dropped dramatically to her knees on the cold marble floor, tilting her head back up and letting a massive flood of pristine manufactured tears stream rapidly down her pale cheeks. "Please, you absolutely cannot arrest me," Caroline wailed loudly, her voice trembling with perfect, flawless theatrical pitch. "I did not know anything about any secret offshore accounts or dangerous mafia debts. I am just a simple, innocent lifestyle influencer. My parents and my wealthy husband handled all the complicated finances, and I was completely unfairly kept in the dark. I am just a scared, fragile girl, and I have absolutely nothing to do with this massive fraud. You are making a terrible, horrible mistake." She sobbed hysterically, holding her delicate manicured hands up in a desperate pleading gesture, hoping that her historical white privilege would magically shield her from a federal indictment. But the agent who confidently stepped forward to physically process Caroline was not a sympathetic man, easily swayed by manipulative artificial tears. It was a fierce, highly decorated black female FBI agent named Valerie, whom I had personally mentored through intense law school classes many years ago. Valerie looked down at the weeping socialite with an expression of absolute unyielding cold stone. She grabbed Caroline's outstretched hands, completely ignoring the frantic loud sobbing, and forcefully yanked the entitled woman directly to her feet. The heavy iron bracelet snapped shut tightly around Caroline's delicate wrists, with a loud, sharp click that echoed beautifully and perfectly through the massive lobby. "Save the tears for the federal judge," Mom Valerie stated flatly, her voice echoing with cold, absolute authority. Caroline let out an ear-piercing, animalistic shriek of pure, unadulterated horror as her pristine, untouched social image was completely, permanently destroyed in front of a dozen witnesses. She dragged her expensive designer shoes aggressively across the floor, kicking and screaming wildly, as the strong agents physically hauled her completely out of the heavy courthouse doors. Preston and Chloe followed right behind her, equally humiliated and tightly bound in heavy iron. I stood incredibly tall and watched the entire fraudulent empire simply vanish into the dark back of armored federal transport vehicles, leaving the marble lobby perfectly, wonderfully quiet once again. The heavy brass doors of the courthouse swung shut with a final resounding thud, cutting off the chaotic sounds of the federal agents outside. The marble lobby was now suffocatingly quiet. I stood in the center of the room, breathing in the cool air, feeling decades of toxic family expectations completely dissolving. Across the polished stone floor stood the only two remaining members of my shattered family. My brother Andre and my mother Yvonne were completely frozen in place like statues of pure despair. They had witnessed their entire universe collapse in minutes. Andre's luxury tech startup was entirely bankrupt, and his accounts were frozen by my corporate legal team. The wealthy white family they had practically worshipped and sold their souls to impress was currently sitting in the back of federal transport vehicles, facing decades in prison for massive racketeering and extortion. Their pristine illusion of black excellence built on self-hatred was permanently dead. Right there on the courthouse floor, Andre was staring blankly at the empty space where his wife had just been dragged away in heavy iron handcuffs. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked cheap and pathetic hanging off his trembling frame. He had sacrificed his own father, his own sister, and his own dignity just to be accepted by people who secretly viewed him as nothing more than a convenient criminal scapegoat. The reality of his profound stupidity was visibly crushing the air out of his lungs, leaving him gasping and hollow. My mother, Yvonne, however, possessed a truly terrifying survival instinct that completely overrode her capacity for shame. She slowly turned her gaze away from the exit doors and looked directly at me. Her eyes darted frantically as her mind rapidly calculated the new power dynamic in the room. The Sterlings were gone, and her beloved son was completely destitute, but the daughter she had thrown away like garbage was secretly the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar venture capital firm. I watched her face transform with sickening speed. The vicious, hateful sneer she had worn just 20 minutes ago completely vanished, replaced by a wide, desperate, fawning smile that made my stomach physically churn with absolute revulsion. "Naomi, my sweet, brilliant daughter," Yvonne cooed, taking a tentative step toward me, her voice dripping with artificial honey and manufactured maternal pride. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, looking at me as if I were a glowing savior descending from the heavens. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness, Naomi. I always knew you had the sharpest mind in this entire family. You own Apex Capital. You built an entire investment empire all by yourself. That is true. Black excellence. And I could not possibly be more proud of you right now. I did not move a single muscle, simply allowing her to dig her own grave with her pathetic, transparent lies. Yvonne took another step closer, her eyes shining with greedy, desperate hope. The Sterlings were horrible, manipulative people. Yvonne continued, waving her hand dismissively toward the exit, as if she had not just been begging them for social acceptance moments prior. They fooled all of us, Naomi. They tricked your poor brother, and they tried to ruin our family. But you saved us. You are so rich and so incredibly powerful now. We do not need them at all. We are still family, Naomi. Blood is thicker than anything else in this world. Let us put all of this ugly business behind us and just go back to my mansion right now. We can sit down in the formal dining room, have a nice warm meal, and figure out how to start over together. You and Andre can partner up and rebuild the family legacy the right way this time. Her sheer, unadulterated delusion hung in the cold air of the lobby. She truly believed that after 10 years of emotional abuse, after calling me a ghetto failure, after watching her golden son frame our bleeding father for assault, she could just smile and invite me back into her house to share my wealth. She thought her maternal title would magically erase a lifetime of toxic manipulation. I looked at my mother with a gaze so entirely devoid of warmth that she finally stopped walking, her fake smile faltering under my lethal stare. "Your mansion?" I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet monotone that echoed sharply off the marble pillars. "You mean the historic gated estate in the affluent district that you love showing off to your country club friends?" "Yes, of course, sweetie." Yvonne nodded eagerly, her fake smile returning as she thought I was actually considering her ridiculous offer. "Our beautiful home. We can go there right now and rest." I slowly shook my head, completely shattering her final desperate illusion. "You do not have a mansion anymore, Mother," I stated coldly, watching the hopeful light instantly die in her eyes. "You see, while you were busy bragging to your fake elite friends about your successful tech CEO son, you never bothered to check how he was actually funding his lavish lifestyle before the Sterlings came along. 6 months ago, Andre secretly used the deed to your precious mansion as collateral to secure a massive high-interest bridge loan from a predatory shadow lender. He needed the cash to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth so Caroline would agree to marry him. When Andre failed his loan payments, the bank quietly foreclosed on your beautiful home last week." I continued, my voice perfectly merciless. "I bought it at the auction. You have 24 hours to clear your things out. I am turning it into a shelter for abused elders." Yvonne collapsed wailing as Andre stood paralyzed, stripped of his golden boy title, realizing he had traded his soul for fake white wealth and lost absolutely everything. It was finally the end of their dark, twisted reign of terror over my life and my precious father's heart. 1 month passed since the heavy brass doors of the courthouse closed on the darkest chapter of my family history. I was sitting on the wrap-around porch of my father's historic Victorian home in the quiet warmth of a Sunday afternoon. The neighborhood was incredibly peaceful, the sound of old maple trees rustling in the breeze replacing the chaotic shouting of aggressive reporters. My father Harrison was sitting right beside me in his favorite wooden rocking chair, swaying back and forth with a gentle rhythmic motion. A tall glass of iced sweet tea rested in his hand, and a thick blanket covered his healing knee. The physical wounds from the baseball bat were slowly fading into faint silver scars, but the most remarkable change was the absolute lightness in his dark eyes. The crushing, suffocating weight of 40 years of emotional manipulation from his toxic wife and his arrogant son had been completely, permanently lifted from his tired shoulders. He was finally safe, entirely at peace, and completely surrounded by the unconditional loyal love he had always deserved. We sat together in a comfortable golden silence, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bicycles down the sunlit street, enjoying the simple, beautiful reality of our new life. The fallout from that explosive afternoon in the courthouse lobby had been incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. I did not have to lift another finger or launch any further official investigations to watch their fake elite empire crumble to absolute dust. The federal justice system and the unforgiving reality of their own massive financial debts did all the heavy lifting for me. Caroline quickly realized that her weaponized white tears and her manufactured influencer victimhood held absolutely zero power against the overwhelming, irrefutable weight of unedited 4K security footage. Her slick defense lawyer advised her to take a desperate plea deal to avoid being transferred to a maximum security federal penitentiary. She is currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a harsh state prison facility for the aggravated felony assault on my father. Her pristine, carefully curated social media accounts were completely overrun by disgusted former fans, and her entire lucrative brand was permanently deactivated. Her parents, Preston and Chloe Sterling, were denied bail entirely by a very unforgiving federal judge. They are sitting in cold federal holding cells, currently facing 15 years each for aggressive wire fraud and massive coordinated money laundering operations. The fake wealth they used to intimidate innocent people vanished, leaving them with absolutely nothing but matching orange jumpsuits. My brother Andre lost his precious Golden Boy title the exact second his frozen corporate accounts made the local evening news. Without my $10 million venture capital funding, and with his shady criminal connections exposed, his tech startup went into immediate total liquidation. His former elite friends and the wealthy white socialites he frantically worshipped instantly blocked his phone number, refusing to be associated with such a spectacular, embarrassing public disgrace. Stripped of his expensive tailored suits and his leased luxury cars, Andre is currently working as a basic cashier at a greasy fast food chain just outside the city limits. He spends his exhausting days wearing a cheap polyester uniform, smelling of fried oil, desperately trying to pay off the massive high-interest shadow loans he took out just to impress a woman who tried to murder our father. My mother Yvonne is living a similarly pathetic, miserable reality. After I legally evicted her from the foreclosed mansion, she was forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood she used to mercilessly mock. She is far too deeply ashamed of her colossal social failure to ever show her face at her exclusive country club again. She spends her days entirely alone, trapped in a miserable box built by her own toxic vanity and unyielding greed. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my iced sweet tea, letting the satisfying quiet truth of their consequences wash entirely over me. I did not feel any lingering bitter anger or any petty need for further dramatic vengeance. The universe had perfectly balanced the scales, giving every single person exactly what they had actively, relentlessly earned. My personal cell phone suddenly began to vibrate loudly on the small wooden table resting between my father and me. I looked down at the bright screen and saw the official state seal of the governor's office illuminating the digital display. I answered the call, placing the device on speakerphone, so my father could hear every single word of the conversation. The voice of the state governor came through crisp and incredibly formal, but filled with a deep, undeniable tone of absolute respect. He told me that my handling of the recent high-profile crisis had shown him exactly the kind of unwavering, fierce integrity and ruthless dedication to absolute justice that this state desperately needed right now. He was officially calling to confirm my formal executive appointment as the brand new state attorney general. I ended the call, and the quiet afternoon air felt incredibly still and perfectly clear. I looked over at my father, watching the heavy tears of genuine, unadulterated pride well up in his kind, aging eyes. He reached across the small space between us and gently placed his warm, weathered hand over mine, giving it a firm, loving squeeze. He did not need to speak a single word because the absolute pure joy radiating from his entire face told me everything I ever needed to know. I had spent a grueling decade being called a ghetto dropout and an ugly, useless failure by the very people who were supposed to protect and nurture me. They thought true black excellence meant hiding your roots, chasing fake white wealth, and stepping heavily on the necks of your own loyal family just to impress elitist people who secretly despised you. but they were completely, utterly wrong about what real power looks like. I smiled back at my father, feeling a profound, unbreakable peace settling deep into my soul. I had successfully protected my sanctuary. I had honored the gentleman who raised me, and I had proven to the entire watching world that you can reach the absolute highest peak of power without ever having to compromise your soul. True power and excellence do not come from chasing elite status, faking wealth, or seeking validation from toxic people who demand you compromise your soul. Real strength comes from standing in your truth, protecting your peace, and building your success in silence. You do not need to shrink yourself to fit into a broken family. When you walk away from manipulation and build your own empire, the universe will perfectly balance the scales. Justice always catches up to those who happily trade their integrity for an empty illusion. Never let anyone define your worth or attempt to dim your light. If you have ever had to cut ties to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more.